So when we're talking about creating pollinator habitat, it's not just a one and done sort of thing. There's a little bit of thought processes that go into creating a successful one. And so we're going to go through these tonight to talk about how this is best done. And it's not simply a matter of needing more flowers, which is a food source for a lot of our pollinator friends, but there's water, shelter, nesting sites and materials that go into it. And then on our part, some conservation practices that are going to help as well. And so it's really the idea, if you put all these things into place, if you build it, they will come. And so we're going to talk about that some more tonight, about what we can do. So what's wrong with this landscape? Well, for one, we've got a monoculture here of a lot of grass, lots and lots of grass, lots of rocks, lots of impervious surfaces. And really, there's only a couple of things I could point out that would be something that would benefit pollinators. We've got this one flowering crabapple tree in the distance here. And then the rocks. I mean, insects like to sun themselves too. And so this is a place for them to warm themselves. But really that's about it. There's not a lot going on as far as benefiting pollinators. And unfortunately, this is what passes for good design in a lot of places. And really what we need is more flowers, right? And we need that diversity of flowers in order to do them a lot of good. So this kind of environment is not the way I want anyone to go when we're talking about helping pollinators. And there's some really good research that's just come out of Missouri about, often the question I field is, well, I live in an apartment, or I just have a tiny little porch, is that too little to do any good for pollinators? And the resounding answer to that bit of research that was out of Missouri is that no area is too small. If you have enough for, a pot or two of some flowers, you're contributing to the collective whole that then becomes part of a neighborhood garden. And so don't be afraid that if your site you have for a pollinator garden is really small. All of us would like to have these huge gardens like this on the right, but if it's a small garden, that's okay too. And I'd first like to talk a little bit about the large concept here. It's really about sustainability, because we've gotten away from where we're taking care of things. And as a consequence, insects have fallen into this terrible point we're in where we really lost some things. So we're not as cognizant of as we could be of our soils, our water, the fossil fuels that we need to truck things in great distances or to run our mowers and string trimmers, using insecticides and herbicides. I mean, if we don't have to use those things, then not only does it save us money, but it's better for the environment as a whole. And then fertilizer. We all know that fertilizers, when overused, end up in our landfills. And so here we have an image of, what happens when you concentrate water. So all that happened here is further uphill at some source, there was a neighborhood that was installed, and that concentrated the water, and suddenly that water had great erosion capabilities. And so when we can do more things that help sustain the environment, like putting in rain gardens, then we're going to be better off overall as far as helping insects. And when we look at pollinators, we're looking at up to 80% of all flowering plants benefiting from the fact that pollinators are moving that pollen around, and 75% of our fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So we like to eat, right? So those things are important to us, not only from the eating standpoint, but from a whole ecosystem. You've probably heard before that the measure of an ecosystem is the health of the insects in that ecosystem. And so pollinators definitely fall in that category. So how do we get from a point where you have all of these things on the left that are needed, and we're trying to push them into these sites that I would almost call them sterile in nature, because when you're trimming shrubs this much, you're trimming off the potential for flowers. You're using lots of evergreens that aren't necessarily good for pollinators as well. It's just a lot of things that we need to think about in order to make these sites work. And I'm going to go through some things that you need to know on how to implement these things. Okay. And so first and foremost, we have to think of the food sources for them, and choosing the right plants is paramount. And within that group of food items, and we're talking about both pollen and nectar sources, we need diversity. What we find is that, and this is some of the research that happened in Nebraska by Natalia Bjorklund, is that the vast majority of our pollinator insects are generalists when it comes to nectar sources, but when it comes to pollen sources, they really are specialists, and those are just needing that one plant or one group of plants to complete their life cycle. So having those kind of things where we have plants that have sterile flowers, we know that happens. Those are the kind of plants we want to stay away from. And then also we want plants that perform well without a lot of inputs. And I'm kind of known for picking on roses, because roses need a lot of inputs in order to make them look good all the time. And so those wouldn't be something you'd want to showcase a lot of in a pollinator landscape, just because they need so many inputs for them to continue to do well. And a lot of times we tend to see pollinators mostly in the late summer, early fall time period, but that doesn't mean that they aren't feeding other times as well. So we really need things that are in flower in spring, summer, and fall in order to provide those consistent food sources. I want to shift our focus just a little bit into the landscape design portion of things. And so there's two main concepts that I want you to really come away with tonight. One of them is this big overarching idea that when we're organizing outdoor spaces, we take the cues that Mother Nature provides when we're designing and organizing those spaces. And it's really about the natural environment of having an overstory, an understory, and then a ground cover. And that ground cover could be lawns, it could be meadows. I mean, it could be a clover lawn for that matter. But those are all the components that we're looking at when we're designing an outdoor space. And it just so happens that these things are really good for pollinators too. Okay. And then one of the other key concepts that I want you to think about, and this is kind of the micro view of things, is utilizing unity. So that's a design principle that we can use to put into our landscapes to make them perform better for pollinators. And it's about grouping the same plants together. So say, for instance, you have 3 purple coneflower plants that you purchased, and you want to put them into the space. It's not about putting one here, one in the side yard, and one in the backyard. It's really about grouping those 3 plants together, because it's going to help those pollinator insects from a foraging perspective. Okay. Layering plants is also really important too. Some research about, the milkweed plants. Insects can be actually confused or not see certain plants. And so having that clear delineation of one height the plant from another is going to be helpful in helping them find those plants as well. And then linking the different plants together, so there's almost a continuous array of plants in the landscapes, gives them optimal food resources to tackle there. So those are the 2 main things, that macro view of really creating that overstory, understory, and that ground plane. And I'll elaborate on that in just a little bit. And then this other idea of unity being achieved through grouping, layering, and linking things together. Okay, so now let's move on to water. So when we have a water component in our landscapes, it can be any of these features. So for a lot of us, it's going to be things like bird baths or a water feature, but you may be lucky enough that you live next to a creek or a pond, and that's going to be a water source as well. What's really critical for them is that we do some options as far as allowing the insects to alight on something so that they're able to access that water without falling in and drowning. So having some pebbles or some large stones or even a little bit of sand will help insects so that we don't lose them that way. And then puddling. So butterflies like to puddle. So in an area where water accumulates, a puddle, as those puddles evaporate, there are minerals that are left behind that they need in their diet. And so they will sponge up those areas of minerals in order to have good health. And so having a puddling area is helpful as far as a water resource too. And then we think of shelter. And one of the things that can really throw insects for a loop is wind, especially, and heaven knows we have lots of wind here, right? And so wind and rainfall can really cause them, really blown off course, really push them far from home. And so protecting insects from the wind and rain is helpful. And when we think about the structures in our landscape that provide that protection from wind and rain, I think of trees and shrubs because they're really the bones of the garden. They're that overstory that I talked about earlier when we're designing landscapes. So having those bones in place, then from there, that layering develops to develop these other plants that go into the landscape. And so in this particular image, you see that instead of trees and shrubs, we actually have a fence that acts as the bones of the garden. And then there's other components too that may be intentional or they may be accidental that are providing shelter as well, like rock piles and dead plant materials are also good for that. Then when we're looking at nesting sites, most of the time we're talking about nesting sites and materials that are used for the egg laying process. So when pollinators, particularly the solitary native bees, are looking for a nesting site, it depends on which type of bee they are. So about 1/3 of our native bees like to nest in hollow tubes, hollow spaces that are created maybe in the stem of a plant, or in like Mary Jane's example here, we have lots of wood that has holes drilled in it. So that's one kind of nesting site. Then the remaining 2/3 of all native pollinators, native bees are ground nesters. And so they need access to the soil. And so there's things that we can do to make sure that that soil is bare. And I'm not saying that 100% of the site needs to be bare soil. You can do the mulching to suppress weeds and make the soil a little cooler for plants. There's nothing wrong with that. But leave some areas free of mulch in order to benefit these ground nesting bees. And one interesting bit of research about that is that it doesn't matter really what kind of inclination that you have on that soil. I mean, it can be from straight up to completely flat, and everything in between works really well for the soil that you leave bare. So don't be afraid that it can only be flat spaces that you have an area that's free of mulch. It can be all different kinds of levels. And then ground covers. So this was interesting. And this was, again, a little bit of an aha moment for all of us when Natalia Bjorklund was sharing with us that outside of Plant Sciences Hall, there was a planting of, I believe it was Grollo sumac, she said, that was kind of a constant hub of activity. She could see ground nesting bees coming and going from the Grollo sumac, but at the same time, she could hear a lot of buzzing going on. So she knew that there were ground nesting bees in that area. And a lot of times when we're using ground covers, we're not necessarily using mulch in those areas. So even though it's technically covered to us, it still is classified as bare soil because insects can readily get in and out of those areas. So here's a really great publication on creating a solitary bee hotel. These are things that you can make yourself and put into the landscape. And I know Kate and Jody will be talking more about this a week from tonight, I think. At any rate, there's a lot that you can get. So you can just do a search, creating a solitary bee hotel, and then put Nebraska extension in and it'll pull it right up for you. But this is another good thing that you can utilize in order to put up pollinator hotels for yourself. And then there's things that we can do that will make a difference. And wherever we can, we want to reduce the amount of pesticide that we use in our landscapes. I remember one time that I got a phone call from a woman who was having problems with these brilliantly colored caterpillars all over her parsley. And when I shared with her that they were probably the caterpillars of the swallowtail butterfly and how beautiful that was, she was kind of disgusted and said, "Oh, I suppose you want me to stop killing them then." So it's really being knowledgeable that some of these things may not have the high degree of perfectness that we're used to seeing in landscape plants. It's really about allowing some of those things to be chewed on a little bit, which the immature stages of a lot of insects have chewing mouth parts, and so they'll chew away at some of our landscape plants. It's really about being tolerant of some of those things. So if we don't have plants that get few insect and disease problems, then it's being tolerant of those few insect and disease problems they get so that we leave those things alone. And we want to be cognizant that, everybody knows that, insecticides automatically cause insects problems, right? But some of these fungicides and herbicides can cause erratic behavior in some of our bees. And so we want to be aware of that. So really it's about any kind of pesticide use, not just insecticide. Spring garden cleanup. So I had talked earlier about how the hollow stems of some of our landscape plants can be spots where egg laying takes place. And so really we shouldn't be cleaning up our garden in the fall of the year. I know a lot of us like to be tidy gardeners and have everything done and ready to go come spring. But when we do that, we're making those hollow stems open to the elements, and those eggs don't survive that. So really delaying that cleanup until the spring is going to make a good difference for the pollinators. No rock mulches. So not only does rock get in the way of the pollinators trying to lay their eggs in the ground for like our native ground nesting bees, but it's not good for trees either. So we definitely want to stay away from the rock mulches. Just not a happy environment for them. And where we can, let's do more things that help with water and being respectful of water. We're actually seeing it at a point now where our aquifers are not recharging at the rate that we're using them. And so that means at some point, drilling wells aren't going to be an option anymore. So if we can make sure that water gets into rain gardens or goes into rain barrels where we can later utilize that water, makes a lot of sense. So I hope a lot of you have heard of the Nebraska Pollinator Habitat Program. It's a wonderful thing. This is the application for it, and you can actually go to the URL is listed down here, http://go.unl/pollinators, and you'll be able to download the application. And the application is an excellent source of information. Not only is there a plant list of spring, summer, and flowering and fall flowering plants, but there's also a whole section on best management practices, some of the things I've talked about right now. So that in a nutshell is design of a pollinator garden. Are there any questions?
Kathleen, in the question answer box, there's a pretty good question in there. Megan's working with a local high school plant science FFA chapter. They want to put on pollinator garden. Their goal is to apply for certification. It's a county church. Oh, I'm trying to read. They're looking for recommendations for water in the landscape. There's no stream, pond close by.
Even if they could add, like a bird bath or something like that, and it'd be somebody's job to go out every so often and dump out the bird bath and put in fresh water. That'll keep the mosquito populations down. Add water if it's dried out, but having those stones for them, the insects to alight on, is going to be an important component. And in one of the pollinator projects I was involved with, we actually did 2 bird baths, one on the pedestal and one not on the pedestal, so that it would have benefit to birds, which some birds are pollinators as well. Having those choices for insects is a good thing too, one high and one down low.
And then how often should the water be refreshed?
48 hours is how long it takes for mosquitoes to develop from larvae into flying mosquitoes. So every 2 days at least, I would dump it out and refresh it. Yeah. There are things that you could add to it, like mosquito dunks, but that would be something that I'd want to ask Jody or Kate about, whether that would be something that would potentially harm pollinators.
The BT, it will not harm pollinators. It's just for the larva dipterans, so the fly larvae.
Well, but it could help, or it doesn't hurt, or does it? Dragonfly larvae?
No, dragonflies are not flies, and it won't hurt any pets or anything like that.
Okay, awesome. So there you have it.
There was another question that popped in about some of your favorite plants for pollinators. It looks like Kelly is answering. Do you have any standout favorites, Kathleen, that just you always want in your garden?
I am always amazed at the number of bees on sedum. In the fall of the year, it is just chock full, and it's not a native plant, but it's just chock full of pollinators buzzing around it. So it's pretty impressive that something non-native is, getting so much attention, but I say yay to that. So.
I know one of my favorites is Joe Pyeweed in the fall, just covered with all sorts of insects, and it just has a tendency to pop up in other species that I don't want it, but it's a great plant to have.
And a close relative of that is it's called the hardy Arboretum. It's Tavara, and that also is covered in pollinators in late in the season. So that's another good one. And I think, we all know that the pollinator insects need plants, not only for the flowers that are provided for the nectar and the pollen, but also for the hollow stems that they provide as a potential egg laying site. But the other thing is that like the leaf cutter bee makes those round circles, and the female uses that to divide one egg and nectar pollen ball from the next egg and nectar pollen ball. So as she's laying those eggs, she likes to put a divide in. And a lot of our native bees are given their name based on what that division is from one egg to the next. And hence the leaf cutter bee uses bits of leaves to divide up. And then there's also one called the carder bee. And carding is an old-fashioned term for carding wool, getting those fibers lined up so that you can work with them in making them into yarn. And so that carder bee gets its name from getting the fuzz off of some plants. So like this senecio here, there are bees that will cut the fuzz off of it and take that to their nesting site and use that as the division from one egg to another. So it's not just a matter of the flowers and the hollow stems, but other plant parts as well, contributing to their life cycle.
One question, Kathleen, that I know that I commonly get here in Omaha is we tell people not to cut back their plants until spring, but what time in the spring would we recommend cutting that back? I never have a good answer. I'm just curious if anybody else on the panel might have a good answer for that.
Yeah, Jody, I would suggest you answer that one.
Okay, which question are we on?
The one about timing. So if you're waiting to cut back the stems of things in the spring of the year, is there one time better than the other?
Well, it depends. If you had your stems open like in last summer, then they won't be coming out until, usually the plant just keeps growing and those stems will just be covered, right? So you can leave those there.
Yeah, would you, it's nice to remove those dead stems, especially when you're seeing that new growth from the crown of a lot of our perennials. But when we want to make sure that those pollinators have emerged, right?
Yeah, if there's pollinators in them, you can cut them and then hang them or put them in a place that's not going to get wet or rained on. And if anything emerges, then, they're still going to be in the garden because you wouldn't want them to go back in those stems anyway. We're talking about that next week when we talk about insects.
Good.
Okay, there's a couple other questions. Kathleen, any recommendations for plants and containers for maybe part shade to sun for pollinators?
Well, there's a lot of them that if they're flowering, they're worth trying. So I know that our application has lists of plants for shade plants as well. So that's one possibility. Also, some of the things that, that are a little bit unexpected. So like if you have a flowering houseplant, those usually do well in a part shade location. And if they flower for you, so much the better. But they also have that potential for offering something to like the leaf cutter bees.
And there is another question about, we talk a lot about the native plants, but they're not always the easiest to find in the garden center. Are there any recommendations where people could look to find some of these plants? I can't say the scientific name of what Sarah's asking for, but I don't know if anybody has any recommendations.
Yeah, so that is an issue. And when we think of our purchasing dollars as votes, the more we're purchasing those different plants or seeds in this case, the more votes we're getting for those growers and nurserymen to continue to offer those plants or those seeds. And so the downside of that is if something's a little more obscure, then it becomes hard to find. I'm a big fan of the amethyst flower, Brawallia. It's really great for containers as well in a part sun, part shade location. Is a good substitute for impatiens, and especially if you have impatiens downy mildew. But yet finding it in 6-packs right now, I haven't found it anywhere all season long. And so the trend is to go towards the larger, fancier annuals that command higher prices in the single packs. And so looking for and asking growers and the nursery and the garden centers about, some of these things, it may be the way to go, just to get some of these more challenging things.
All right. Are there any other questions? I see that some people have written in the chat and the Q&A about some options to find some plants. Anybody else have any questions for Kathleen?
And I'm looking at one of these questions in the chat about finding some of these seeds and plants has proven to be an interesting challenge. Agreed, absolutely. But we didn't want people to be limited by what necessarily was readily found in the trade. If that meant you had to do a little more searching, then so be it. At the Takema Pollinator Garden Project, there was one milkweed that the only place we could find it was by joining a native plant society out of Kansas, which we did. And we were able to get a flat of seedlings of this particular type of milkweed. So yeah, absolutely. It's going to be hard to find some of these things. But just remember what I mentioned about there's generalists and specialists. And the vast majority of pollinators are generalists when it comes to a nectar source. And when it comes to the protein source, that pollen, they're specialists. And so having that range of options is really critical. And so those landscapes that consist of the same 5 plants throughout the landscape are not going to be pollinator habitat. It's really about having those groupings of very diverse plants in the landscape that's going to make a difference for them.
All right, any other questions? Oh, somebody also just chimed in. The Nebraska statewide Arboretum is a great place for different plants. So we don't want to forget about our partners there. Any other questions? Oh, there's a couple that just popped in. Kathleen, do you see them?
How mature should our habitat be before applying for certification? Right now, we have some plants started in the greenhouse with plans to begin initial planting in a month or so. And we're still at the very beginning, but eager. So I take care of the applications for the pollinator habitat program. And I can tell you, we get the whole range, the whole gamut of people in their establishment phase. And one of the things that we ask people is to submit photos of their landscapes. And so some of those you can tell the plants are just really, really new. But in their excitement, they want to apply to the program. And so really, as long as you fulfill the parameters that we set in the program, then it it's okay if it's a new garden. That's absolutely fine. And if it's still garden, that's fine too. You know, we know a lot of people out there probably have a lot of these things going on in their landscape already. And so they're a natural for having their garden certified. And it's not about just getting as many certifications across the state as possible. It's really about starting that conversation. So if people get the certification, put up the sign in their landscape, that becomes a talking point for neighborhoods, for businesses. And once we get that conversation going, then that is our opportunity to talk to more people about the benefit of pollinators and what they do for us.
And Larry put into the question answer, he is starting a new wildflower garden this week. It looks like about 2,000 square feet. For next spring, what is the best method to cut the previous year's growth back to 8 to 12 inches? Hand shears, weed whacker, any type of recommendations?
Or more set on a low setting. I know that in a lot of wildflower plantings or prairie plantings, they really require burning every 3rd year, and that may not be practical in urban landscapes. But if you live in a more rural area and you have that option to burn it every 3rd year, that would be the way to go. And then in the intervening years, you could just mow it down each spring.
And then something that Suzanne in the chat asked a really good question about the old-fashioned plants, like the old-fashioned phlox, black-eyed Susan, iris. Are those better for the pollinators versus some of those new RAW hybrids that are on the market?
Yeah, Scott, I think that would be one that would be better answered at your program, just from the standpoint of you're going to talk about double flowers versus single flowers, right? So maybe, I don't know if you want to tackle any of that right now, or if you want to just put that off till 2 weeks away, that's fine too.
Hey, just quickly, they have found that some of the double flowering plants, insects are tiny. They have a tiny mouth, they have a tiny tongue. And when we add all those extra flower parts, they need to work extra hard to get down to any possible nectar or pollen. And sometimes to get those extra flower parts, the geneticist or the plant breeder will turn those stamens, those anthers, they can become actual flower petals. And so some of that nutrition isn't there. So there's also some research coming out from University of Maryland that some of these newer RAW cultivars like Echinacea, you can get a cone flower that is pink, green, purple, I mean, every color of the rainbow nowadays, but some of that DNA is having a negative effect on our native species type. So there's a lot of interesting research. So sticking to some of those basic plants, that's not a bad thing at all. I hope that answers your question, Suzanne.